Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures, Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, A Year in the Life of a Polar Bear, 2022 edition, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Eleanor Edye. I'm your host, Rob Bess. Thank you all so much for joining us here today. Over to you, Eleanor.
Thanks so much, Rob, and hi to everybody who's tuning in today. So happy to see so many of you people here to learn more about polar bears. Before we get into it, I'll just briefly introduce myself. Like Rob was saying, my name is Eleanor Edye, and I'm one of the expedition leaders for Natural Habitat Adventures. I am one of our Canadian-based guides, so I work in Churchill for all of the seasons that we have in Churchill, including our fall polar bear trips. So today, what I want to talk about is polar bears. It's all about the polar bears and what they do and how they move through their habitat over the course of a year. And if you've ever tuned in the past, you may have seen me do this last year, the year before. I try to do it once a year and kind of bring in new information that's come up every year about how polar bears are doing right now. So we'll kick it right off and start talking about our bears. And we'll start off with some basic polar bear facts that get you into the year of a bear. So a little bit about the polar bear. So you can see them here. We know them. You might know them from anything from WWF promotional material to talking about conservation of the Arctic to being the mascot of the Coca-Cola bottles, right? So we interact with them quite a bit in pop culture, but they are a lovely big Arctic mammal. Scientific name is Ursus maritimus, means the maritime bear or the bear of the sea ice. They are found globally around the Arctic area, and global population estimates are anywhere between 22 to 31,000 individuals. If you were to pick one number to run with, you usually see about 25,000 individuals as our best estimates globally of how many bears there are. They sit in with the other extant, other living bears of the world in our chart here. So this is a cladogram showing us the evolutionary pathway that has brought us to today's bears. On the right-hand side of this chart, you can see the true bears, which include here the brown bear, the polar bear, the American and Asiatic black bear, sun bear, sloth bear, and spectacled bear. And then way over to our left-hand side there is the giant panda. We do not consider the giant panda to be a true bear, but it did split off from that bear family many, many millions of years ago. If you look at the far right-hand side of this graph here, so this being a cladogram, it's showing you the relative relationness between the different species of bears. So the closer they are together, the closer they are genetically as well. And far over on the right, we have both the brown bear and the polar bear being a fairly recent division from each other. The polar bear, things that we know about the evolution of the polar bear, we do know that they evolved from an existing population of brown bears. In terms of when that happened, you'll find estimates anywhere from around 100,000 years ago to 600,000 years ago. I've even seen some numbers as far back as 2 million years ago, but it's very difficult to tease out exactly when the polar bear started to exist as we know it now because of continued interbreeding between the brown bear and the polar bear species. If you were again to pick your favorite number to run with, I tend to pick 600,000 as the one that I feel strongest about, but I'm always open to new evidence that pops up. So polar bear, fairly recent species on the global scale, most closely related to brown bears, and of course then related to all the existing bears on Earth as well. The bears that you can see in this image here, this is not a polar bear and a grizzly bear. These are two grizzly bears. Grizzly name is a name for a subgroup of brown bears. And in terms of how we think the polar bear started to exist, keep in mind that everything that we say is always has a large amount of speculation involved in it. We know that beyond at least 2 million years ago, there were no polar bears. And around 600,000 years ago, there were polar bears. We also know that they are most closely related to brown or grizzly bears, and that we think that how polar bears started their existence was that a small population of brown bears were separated from the main population by advancing glaciers or sea ice at some point in the past during a period of global cooling. During that period of isolation, they likely ventured onto the sea ice and hunted other animals that they would have been looking for, things like young seals that weren't used to having predators. And over time, selection favored those bears that had light coats and had those traits that allowed them to survive well in cold, harsh Arctic environments. They have evolved to be highly specialized to life on the sea ice, with a number of evolutionary features that we'll point out as we go through our year in the life of a polar bear. Obviously, in 1 hour, we can't get through everything. If you've ever looked at joining us on one of our polar bear trips, I promise you that your expedition leader will speak for hours and hours and hours on polar bear biology, so we can't get through everything all at once, but I hope to give you a nice overview and a snapshot of what these bears are like. So globally, as I mentioned, there's around 25,000 polar bears. They're found in 5 different countries: the US, Canada, Denmark by way of Greenland, Norway by way of Svalbard, and Russia. They do occasionally pop up elsewhere, like Iceland, but those are just itinerants. They usually just pop up on ice floes. The majority of these bears, about 16,000 of the global 25,000, are found in Canadian waters and on Canadian land. These 25,000 bears are divided up into 19 different subpopulations that are grouped mostly for management purposes. There is gene flow between these populations. They're not separated by walls or oceans. So there is flow between the populations, but most of the time, bears are more likely to mate within their population and to stay within those ranges than to move outside of it. If we look at this map here of these polar bear subpopulations and where they live, you'll notice likely that they are found generally in coastal areas. They're not so much found at the North Pole. That's not good polar bear habitats. Polar bears like coasts. They like shallow water. They like annual ice for the most part. And while some bears will live their entire lives on the sea ice, most of them will use the land occasionally for resting during the ice-free season or for denning. This map here shows those 19 subpopulations and the trends in population sizes. So we can see that there's a number of white marked populations there where we don't have enough information to say which way those populations are trending. Blue means that we think those populations are stable. Yellow means increasing, and red means a population decrease on average. As we go through and talk about these polar bears, certainly all of this information pertains to the global polar bear population, but I will be specifically focusing in on the Western Hudson Bay population. That is where NatHab runs polar bear trips. It's one of the most studied populations of polar bears in the world, and also one of the most easily accessible. It's also one that we see here marked as red for a declining population. So it's a good one to zero in on and talk about conservation concerns, as well as recognizing that it's the bears that most people will see at some point if they get a chance to see bears, just because they are some of the easiest ones to get to. So let's hop right in and get into our year in the life of a bear now that we know a little bit about the global bear population. And I want to start our year by talking about spring. And I want to start in the spring as opposed to, New Year's or the school year that's about to start, because spring is really the time for polar bears. It is the most important time of the year. They get basically all their needed calories in this time. They mate at this time. If a bear has a successful spring in terms of getting its calories and having successful mating, really, to a certain point, the rest of its year is taken care of. So it is a time of plenty, and it is the most important most important season for that bear. In this image, you might look at it and say to yourself, now, Eleanor, this doesn't look like spring. This looks like winter. All I see is ice. Let me assure you that in a polar bear state of mind, this is spring. Springtime in the Arctic can look very different than where you're living. Spring, I'm still talking here about our spring months, usually involving, the end of March and maybe April, May, first half of June, or even into July. These are what we would call the spring in the Arctic. I know that this is spring for a couple of reasons. One, there's a lot of light showing on this bear, so it's got a nice high sun, so we're not looking at the midwinter here. And I can also see a bird in the upper right-hand area of this image. This is a glaucous gull. These birds migrate up to the Arctic in the springtime and they scavenge polar bear leftovers. So we know, looking at this, that we are looking at a picture of a spring bear, and this particular bear is likely having a good day because this bear has hunted. And what these bears are hunting, there's some variation in what any one bear will take, but the majority of bears are looking for their main prey species, which is the ringed seal. This is a beautiful ringed seal that you can see here on the right, and their distribution around the circumpolar area is on the left-hand side there. They are the smallest of all seal species. They are also the most common seal in the Arctic, and they are the most commonly eaten by polar bears. Now, polar bears will also eat walrus, they will eat harp seal, hooded seal, harbor seal, bearded seal, narwhals, bowhead, beluga. They'll catch fish and eat them sometimes as well, but ringed seals are the mainstay of your average polar bear's diets. And if you were to kind of mentally overlap the map of the ringed seal distribution and the map of the polar bear distribution, you would have a roughly 1-for-1 equivalence. If you have ringed seals, you have polar bears. If you don't have ringed seals, you likely don't have polar bears either. Now, ringed seals, it's not that they're only eaten in the springtime. Ringed seals can be hunted by a polar bear anytime that there's an ice platform for a bear to hunt from. But spring, like I said, is the time of plenty. Why is this? Well, if we think about where seals are usually found, they're generally found underwater. That's where they spend their life. They sleep in the water for the most part as well. But in the springtime, a couple of things happen. One is that the seals will molt. So they come up onto the ice ledge, and they will sit in the sun and bask in the sunlight, and they will replace their fur at this time of year. So they're a bit of an easier pickings at this time for a polar bear. The other thing that happens in the springtime is that ringed seals will pup. So they will give birth to a single seal pup, and they actually give birth to these pups above water as well, which makes sense when you think about it. Those young pups aren't ready to start swimming in those Arctic waters just yet. So ringed seals will use stable ice with pressure ridges. So where ice sheets move together, you often get this buckling of the ice as a couple of different ridges will push together. Where those pressure ridges happened, snow as it blows over will form these beautiful big snowdrifts. They will excavate out inside that snowdrift and give birth to a pup inside that den. Now, at birth, these pups are only about 10 pounds, but 6 weeks later, when they are weaned, they're around 60 pounds. And of that 60-pound weight, about 75% of that weight is pure fat. So I've got a lovely colleague who refers to these seal pups as blubber cookies that polar bears can just basically stroll around and pick off the sea ice as they walk around. And it's a little more difficult than that, but the main cause of ringed seal mortality in the pups is by far and away polar bears. So polar bears like those fat pups. Those pups are not very quick to move. They will come, break into the maternity den, take that pup out, pull the fat off of it, and walk away and looking for their next pup. And these polar bears are very well-designed machines to kill seals in general, but their other prey species as well. So you can see here their dentition. This is not this is not something I would recommend anybody else do here. This is a WWF polar bear researcher right now working on a tranquilized bear. giving us a great shot of polar bear teeth. So while like other bears, the polar bear is technically an omnivore because they do consume berries and kelp and other things as well. Um, for their calories, they really rely completely on meat. And as adults, specifically, they rely on fat. You can almost call them a lipivore because they will prioritize fat consumption so thoroughly. But those teeth are sharp, their jaws are strong, and they are able to grab seals, crush the back of their necks and their skulls and tear through flesh with no problems whatsoever. In fact, these bears, when they are going around picking seal pups off the ice, they will actually just peel the fat off in a layer, leaving the muscle behind for the various scavengers that follow behind polar bears, because unless we have a juvenile bear, that protein is not needed or wanted. They have incredible metabolic efficiency, around 98% uptake for fat. Take a second and think about that, 98% fat uptake. I am very glad for me that we don't have 98% uptake, because then you think about, eating ice cream or eating butter on your bread in the morning, and think if we actually put 98% of that fat onto us as fat reserves, that would not go so well for us. But it's a very, very good thing for a polar bear who lives in an area where there's sometimes a lot of available calories and sometimes nearly zero available calories. They're not as efficient at metabolizing protein, but still pretty far up there, around 78% efficient. Just a quick note that it's not all about the polar bears, because the polar bears actually do provide kills for other animals to scavenge on. This is that glaucous gull I was talking about. So it's a main scavenger of polar bear kills in the springtime. And it's part of the larger marine ecosystem and marine food web. Interestingly, the glaucous gull is not the only scavenger on polar bears. There's also another one that you probably know already, which is the Arctic fox. This here is as you can see, it's an aerial shot looking down at a polar bear kill site. This was taken by a research crew just this past spring here, and you can see the bloody smear from the seal kill. But if you look up in the top center right there, you can see a white Arctic fox just running away from the helicopter. These Arctic foxes don't spend their whole life on the sea ice, but they will often leave in the springtime to follow along behind the polar bears as they're hunting. And in fact, sometimes these foxes can get stuck quite far out onto the sea. I love this picture. This is not mine. This is from 2018. A crab fishing boat off the coast of Labrador found an Arctic fox hanging out on an iceberg, and this fox was rescued and brought to shore and was healthy and ran off. So wasn't so happy to be scooped out of the water and brought on the boat. The crew did report that Vienna sausages did help the situation and kept that fox happy. But Arctic foxes are very closely associated with the polar bear, especially in the springtime, and are just incredible animals in and of themselves. So leaving aside Arctic foxes, because we could do a whole webinar just on those, what else are those polar bears doing in the spring aside from feeding the Arctic foxes and feeding themselves? Well, the other main thing they are doing in the springtime is mating and breeding. So spring is used as breeding time. Take a look at this image here. We are not looking at a male and a female fighting over breeding. These are actually two males. It can be very, very difficult to sex bears, particularly at a distance. I can tell you that these are two males because, well, the one on the right makes it a bit more obvious, thankfully. So you can see some of the sheath hairs along the genitalia there, but you can also see on big polar bears especially, they have what are called long guard hairs on the forelegs. So it's almost like feathering on the back of their front legs. So there's very, very fierce competition for mates. It's very rarely fatal, but it can cause scarring, jaw injuries, tooth injuries. And we think it's the main reason why male bears don't live as long as females, is that On average, because female polar bears only have cubs every 3 years, they're only interested in mating every 3 years, which means that you have about 3 times as many males as you do for every female, meaning that males generally have to compete for access to females. So they do sexually mature around the age of 6. Females will start breeding right away at the point where they hit sexual maturity, but males usually can't win this fight until they're at least 10 years old. So they have to be the biggest, baddest boy on the block for getting access to those females. If we look at kind of what results from that is that this extreme competition for access to polar bear females among the male population has given us what we call extreme sexual dimorphism. Here we are looking at a male and a female, and I bet you can guess right off the hop which one is which. We have our male on the left and female on the right. So a male polar bear will range in weight, depending on the time of year and at the age, between around 800 to 1,500 pounds, whereas females will be more like 300 to 500 to 600 pounds. Even by the time they're a couple of months old, they are already larger than, like males are already larger than females, and by the time they're a year old, they're already about a third bigger than female cubs. Once these pairs do find each other, they will generally stay together about 2 to 3 weeks. They mate repeatedly. That repeated mating is required because female polar bears are induced ovulators. They have to mate repeatedly before an ovule is released. And during this time, that male polar bear has to protect that female bear from being accessed by other males. So you don't just have to be the biggest, baddest boy on the block. You have to continually, for 3 weeks, be the biggest, baddest boy on the block. As this continues, as they continue to mate, additional ovules will be released, meaning that if you get another big, bad polar bear coming in and pushing that first one off, if you have a litter of twins or triplets, they may actually have different sires. Now, something really interesting happens, and it's not unique to polar bears, but it's still really cool, and it's something called delayed implantation. So once that mating is done and the egg and the sperm have met and they start to divide, they will actually cease divisions at a stage called the blastocyst. So that's when you start to get a hollow ball of cells. It's only about 200 to 300 cells. And that blastocyst, or those blastocysts, if there's more than one, will remain free floating in the uterus for the next number of months, and will in fact be resorbed if a minimum amount of fat storage is not achieved. So sometimes we get asked in the summer if that's a pregnant female, and it's hard to say yes to that because any female who is mated in the spring is only maybe pregnant through the summer. And it all depends whether she has enough fat to get her through a pregnancy as to whether or not she will be able to actually have those blastocysts implant, go on to become embryos and polar bear cubs. So what does a successfully fat pregnant polar bear look like? It looks like this. She looks like this. And this is a wonderful picture. And we've now moved on to summertime. So summertime for the polar bears really means, well, whenever the ice melts. So that could be July in our Western Hudson Bay population area. It could be August. And I still love this bear. This was a few years back, and this bear, we could tell right away this was a pregnant female. Your fattest bears in the population are always going to be the pregnant females, and this one would actually be categorized as obese, which we love to see in our bears. So she's not just fat on her rump, she's not just fat on her belly, she's fat in her neck and her chest and her front legs. And I'll tell you that I saw her walking around and she would go about 3 steps and then stop and pant, and then go another few steps and stop and pant, which is exactly what you want your pregnant females to look like, because she has a long wait to go until she's going to get a chance to eat again. Now, this female will almost definitely be giving birth later on, and she's probably 900 to 1,000 pounds. This is a very, very big female bear. Now, but female bears and pregnant female bears aren't the only ones who come off the ice. Our ice in Western Hudson Bay is seasonal ice, so it will disappear every year at some point in the summer. So at some point in the summer, all of the bears that have been on Hudson Bay have to move to land, and they then start to metabolize their fat stores that they have put on by eating those seal pups during the spring. So they will remain on the ice as long as there is ice. So even if there's just a little bit of ice, if there's a lot of ice, they will use it. This habitat here, this image, we would call this still decent bear habitat. They will usually start to come off the ice when it's about 50% ice, 50% water. At the point where they're getting as wet as they are able to be on the ice, that is the point where those bears will say, okay, the ice is done, time to head on to land. And this year, the ice breakup was, relatively late in terms of our current trends. So here we're looking at the Hudson Bay region, and this is July 15th of this year, and where a number of tracked bears were located. So July 15th, we're looking at those bears and they all look like they're swimming in the water. They're actually sitting on a shelf of ice that sits just off the coast of Hudson Bay, just off the coast of Manitoba and Ontario, the provinces that we're in here. And the first bear was off on July 9th, but in fact, as we moved through the summer, this big ice shelf remained close to Churchill. So Churchill is, if you follow the coast of Hudson Bay down from the top there, it does a right angle bend. That's where Churchill is located. And this ice shelf just kind of stayed there through basically all of July and into August, meaning that there was really good habitat for polar bears to remain on even into the late summer. This is interesting. It's more close to historical norms than we've seen for quite a while. In a lot of more recent years, as we've seen global temperatures warming, that ice breakup has happened earlier and earlier every year on average. For example, last year, this is what the ice situation looked like. You can see that there's some clouds, but there's actually very little ice left remaining. This is actually only July 6th. So last year, early July, all the bears were off the ice. This year, in mid-August, was pretty well when all the bears were off the ice. So these bears in Western Hudson Bay got a full extra 6 weeks being on the ice relative to what they got last year. And that's really, really important time for bears to be on the ice. As we were just talking about the springtime is the most important time to the polar bear, and it's the most important time for them to have ice. So the fact that we had a more prolonged, extended spring season for them this year was really important to the conditions of the bears that we saw. So this is looking at one of the more recent photos here from August 12th. You can see here that pretty well all the bears, those colored dots there, are on shore, but some are actually still on the ice. So there's still a remnant of ice out there even today that one bear is hanging on to. So it's been a pretty late summer for those bears on average. And we saw, just anecdotally, a lot of really good looking bears. Now, if you're wondering how those bears can handle swimming from the ice onto shore, let me assure you that polar bears are exceptionally good swimmers. They have these massive paws, they're dinner plate size, around a foot across, and the claws are almost like little ice picks. I like to say that they're able to get into your boat before you can get out of it if you're, silly enough to boat right next to a polar bear. They do have non-slip paths on their feet, and polar bears are record breakers in many ways, one of which is the longest single distance swim ever recorded, which was done a number of years back by a polar bear female, which was over 400 miles, 687 kilometers long swim without breaking for land. So they are well able to move from that ice shelf just off the coast of Hudson Bay, off the coast of Churchill onto land with no problems. Summertime, once they're on land, is primarily a time for rest and a time for conserving those calories. So when bears arrive on land, they tend to distribute themselves around. Females with cubs tend to stay away from mature males. Sometimes they'll dig down through the ground to get to that permafrost, that permanently frozen ground, to cool themselves down. And some of them will do some feeding. It's primarily opportunistic, right? So they may come across a snow goose colony and eat eggs. They may eat berries. They may find various carcasses. We don't see them generally moving a whole lot in the summer, and they tend not to move quickly because that's like, you're looking at this bear prostrate on the ground here. That is a hot summer day for a bear. I don't even know how warm it was, but I can tell you, as soon as that sun starts shining, it's a hot day for a bear. This past summer, just a few weeks back, we've seen a lot of bear activity happening in the Churchill area already. It's been a very busy bear year, bear summer in Churchill. And this polar bear pair is giving us an example of opportunistic feeding. This was just viewed from a beluga whale viewing boat this past beluga whale season. And it's a mom and her cub of the year feeding opportunistically on a washed up beluga whale carcass. So you can see that they're just lying in the water, staying cool. They have the remnants of a carcass in front of them on the shore, and they are just feeding as they want to. So this next image is of that same pair. So that's that cub and the mom. And you can see that, again, these bears have recently come off the ice. They have had a good spring. And when you look at that mama bear on the right, you can see that her back actually comes up over her rump and it sags down under her belly. So that's showing us that her fat storage is still doing really, really well. She's in great shape, and her cub is also nice and plump. Again, exactly what we want to see through the summer, especially in a time of year where they're not able to get many calories from elsewhere. This is a very lovely pair of bears that we got to watch over and over again through the summer. You might not even be able to tell what's going on here, but this is the mom on the left-hand side and the cub on the right, and they're actually just swimming in the water with their faces fully submerged. And they were spending some time just looking for fish and playing around. Now this, I mentioned that this is a cub of the year. So this cub would have been born this year, and I'll talk about cubs in a couple of minutes. Cubs spend around 2.5 years on average with their mothers learning how to be a good bear. And this particular situation, when there's only one cub, these moms have to spend a lot of time playing and tussling and teaching their cub. So this particular pair spent hours wrestling in the water. And if you see this mama's just chomping onto the back of her cub's neck, it's just being done in play. They spent a good amount of time there just splashing around in the water, wrestling. Aside from doing that, really, it's a time of rest and finding calories if you can. And if she hadn't had a rambunctious cub, this female probably would have been just resting herself. And resting really all the way until we get to fall. Fall is when the ice starts to form again. And fall, if you're a polar bear again, doesn't necessarily have an exact date on it, but it's when you put your nose up in the air and sniff, and you can smell the cold water and the ice starting to form. So ice will begin in Hudson Bay. Really, usually at the beginning of November, we start to get some ice formation. Churchill is quite the little ice factory. So it's Churchill sits on a spit of land and right along the continental shelf. So there's a lot of productivity of the area. There's lots of fish, lots of seals. And as the ice comes onto the bay through the fall, it really starts on the west side, moves across, and then when it leaves, it goes in the opposite direction. So the ice tends to leave from the eastern side and remain on the west longer. So I know that animation is a bit choppy, but we're getting the main things across here is that the area around Churchill is one of the first places that ice forms and one of the last places that ice leaves. So it's a great place for bears to sit and wait for the ice to come. If we're talking averages here, September 30th is usually considered the sea ice minimum. So in any given year, September 30th is roughly when there's the least amount of sea ice. And then when we head into October 1st, on average, it should be starting to accumulate again. Now, we're obviously not into this year's fall yet. What happened last year? Last year was a late freeze year in some ways. We started off the fall with a very, very warm bay. So we're seeing here colors showing us temperature abnormalities. Ice did start to form in the Churchill region more or less on schedule, but it took longer than average or longer than normal for ice to track across the rest of the bay. So as of December 1st, 2021, some bears had left, but many bears were actually still on shore at that point. And that is, if we look at historical norms, that is a very late time for polar bears to get out. And if we think about last year, all the bears being off the ice around July 5th, and that on December 1st, most of the bears were still on shore. That is a very, very long fasting period for those bears. So all of July, August, September, October, and November, 5 months without being able to eat adequately, and still some time to go. So the fact that this spring, 2022, we saw that amount of ice still left behind on Hudson Bay well into August really meant for those bears that they were able to put on weight that they maybe were able to get last fall. So it was a good, not a great fall for them last year, but a much, much better spring. Now, if you were to come up and travel with Natural Habitat Adventures for our polar bear specific trips, you would come visit Churchill in the fall, in October or November. Like I said, we often do see bears in the summer as well, but fall is definitely what we call bear season. And it is when the most bears are in the area on average, and also when we tend to get better viewing opportunities because there are bears that tend to, muster up along the coast. As temperatures drop, those bears can become more active as well. So in the summertime, like I said, a lot of bears spend their time sleeping and resting, whereas when it starts to get cool and bears aren't going to overheat as easily, you can have bears showing behaviors like this, which is sparring. At this time of year, their testosterone is quite low. They are able to spar without injuring each other, or at least not without drawing a little bit of blood. And this particular image is of mature males, but we see sparring in young bears as well sometimes, especially last year. In 2021, I mentioned last year that the freeze up was later, which meant in 2021 that bears were spending more time in the Churchill region in larger numbers during basically the entirety of the viewing season. So it was a cool fall, but still warmer than average, meant that bears had migrated to the coast on time, but there wasn't enough ice for them to move off and start hunting on the bay. What this meant is that we got to see some interesting behaviors and interactions, and I don't think I'd ever taken a photo before this time of 5 bears just hanging out together on the ice. This is a very, very normal late season picture, lots of clouds, a little bit of snow on the ground, ice on the ponds already. This was, the sun had already come up, even though it looks like it's kind of after dark. And I've never seen, like I said, 5 young bears just hanging out together like this and occasionally playing. So there was lots of playful behavior that we saw last year, lots of sparring with younger bears and older bears as well. Play behavior is certainly one kind of bear behavior that we see in the fall when they start to congregate up. Another one, though, was the fact that moms and cubs are actually quite wary of other bears. And there's a few different reasons for this. The main reason being that, unfortunately, like a lot of animals out there that don't have a direct hand in raising their young, hopefully not fathers, but male polar bears will sometimes predate cub polar bears as a way of feeding themselves in the fall. So anytime a female and her cubs are around big male bears, they tend to get quite skittish. So you can see in this image here, the mom's in the middle and her cubs are all looking in the same direction because they caught a scent of a male bear coming in. And as soon as that bear started to approach, those bears just hightailed it in the other direction. These bears, or these cubs, are, you can see they're almost the same size as mom. They're getting up there. So they're what we call yearlings, meaning that they've already been around over a year, and they're likely to then be weaned next spring when their mom will then go and mate again. Now, this is what we see. We see young bears, like the ones that we're playing. We see moms with cubs. We see adult males. The bears you will not see on these polar bear trips are pregnant females, because through the summer, these bears who have mated in the springtime and they've been conserving their calories through the winter, or sorry, through the summer, will then, in the fall time, as that weather gets cooler, go through a metabolic process where their body decides, based on the lipid content of her blood, does she have enough fat to sustain a pregnancy? If she has enough fat, does she have enough fat for 1 cub, 2 cubs, 3 cubs? So the fatter she is, the more blastocysts will implant. As those blastocysts implant and as she becomes officially pregnant, she will then start to head into a denning area, which in Churchill is just to the south and east of the Churchill area itself, into what's called Wapusk National Park, where there are some established den sites. So, oh, sorry, this is another one of mums and cubs here. Next one here is showing you a polar bear den. So this is an unused den, I hope, obviously. In the fall, when those pregnant moms come in, they will head into their den, they'll make themselves comfortable. And at some point, as the snow starts to blow over and seal them in, they will start to gestate, and they will gestate for about 60 days. Now, keep in mind, for those females, they came off the ice whenever the ice broke up. Let's say it was early July, like happened last year. They then, instead of going onto the ice and eating with the rest of the bears, instead have to go into their dens and gestate and then nurse. So they can spend up more than 240 days fasting while they are pregnant, while they are nursing. And that is still so incredibly powerful to me. And I've yet to meet a pregnant person, including myself, who can go, more than 3 hours in between eating back in the day. So 240 days of fasting to end up with a cub or more cubs at the end of it. They have to have that sufficient fat store to make that happen. And that's a minimum of around 200 pounds of fat per pregnancy. So they will lose around 300 pounds over the winter on average for that average litter size of around 1.5 cubs. So you'll see singletons and twins, and every so often you see triplets when they've had a really, really good year. So in terms of where they go, as I mentioned, they go into that polar bear maternity denning area in Wapusk National Park. So up on the top left, that's the coastal area where we do our viewing. And then when they are needing to den, they go inland around 30 to 60 miles where there is sufficient peat for their dens to be built. As last year continued, so looking here into mid-December 2021, this is when we finally saw all the bears on the ice last year. So it wasn't until that mid-December point, and that ice was only found on the western half of Hudson Bay. And as mentioned, through the course of the winter, that ice will expand, cover the rest of the bay, and those bears will then spread out and spend their time going around, perhaps mating with other populations, checking things out, and hunting ring seals on the ice. Now, we mentioned ring seals in the spring that they eat a lot of pups, but they are able to eat in the winter as well. The hunting success of a polar bear in the winter is lower than it is in the springtime, but they're still able to hunt those seals at the intersection of those habitats, right? So we need that seal breathing hole. That is where the polar bear's world and the seal's world overlap. So each ring seal will maintain around 4 to 5 breathing holes, and they'll maintain it with the sharp claws on their flippers. And a polar bear, when it sits at a ring seal breathing hole, around 10% of the time, it gets lucky and it successfully hunts that ring seal. And you can see, just looking at the shape of that bear's head, how well it is designed in that kind of conical shape to be able to stick its head into an icy hole and bring it back out without getting stuck underwater. This is a hunting bear in the next photo. Polar bear hunting, until you see the aftermath, it doesn't usually look very exciting. They usually just look like they are sleeping or sitting around. And in fact, we used to think that this was a resting bear, but now we know that this is a hunting bear. And the majority of hunts look just like this. As seals push their head out of the breathing hole, bears will get a fraction of a second of warning as that little wave of water comes up, and they stick their head in, grab the seal, and pull it out. Mothers, because they have to hunt for cubs as well as for themselves, spend around 50% of their days hunting, catching seals around every 5 to 6 days on average. Cubs don't hunt as often, but they do start to learn how to hunt pretty early. And as mentioned, cubs will stay with their mom, learning how to hunt, learning how to move around the ice and how to move around other bears, how to be safe for around that 2.5-year mark. Though it's been known in some very productive areas for bears to be weaned at 1.5 years old, or in non-productive areas like the high Arctic, they might not be weaned until they're 3.5. They're well able to stay warm in the cold with these insulating hairs. So polar bears have a double layer of hair. They have the undercoats as well as guard hairs on the outside. Their fat is also somewhat insulating, and the combination of this hair, which similar to a deer's hair is hollow in the middle, providing that extra insulation and buoyancy when swimming, that fat fur combination is so effective at insulation that a resting bear can be virtually invisible to infrared cameras. So a healthy bear has a harder time staying cool enough than warm enough, even in the winter. So even in the winter, you'll often see them doing behaviors like pressing their inner thighs onto the ice or spreading out. And most of their heat is lost through their feet and through their muzzle and their breath. Now, before we're done with winter and we head back into spring, though, there is something else that happens in the winter, and that is the birth of those cubs. So I said that come the fall, those pregnant moms move into the dens. They gestate for about 60 days, and then around Christmas or New Year's or thereabouts, their cubs are born. And when they are born, they are so very, very tiny. They're only 1 to 2 pounds at birth. Which is just a fraction of the mother's mass, one of the greatest size discrepancies between mothers and cubs in the mammal world. Most commonly, we have twins, or like I said, around 1.5 cubs on average. This is obviously a zoo photo. It's hard to take pictures inside a polar bear den. And after they are born, as you can imagine, this cub is not ready to head out on the ice. This cub has to stay behind, and they will remain in that den for another 3 months or so before they're ready to head back out onto the ice. They do grow quite rapidly. The polar bear mom's milk is around 30 to 45% fat. And come February or March, they will push open the den, emerging, spend some time acclimating to the winter temperatures before heading out onto that ice to hunt. And if that mom has timed it right, and if she's in good enough shape and everybody's ready to go, they should arrive on the ice just in time for seal pup season. So she is then able to refatten herself and get her weight back up to where it needs to be to support those cubs and support their nursing by feeding on those seal pups, just like we saw last spring. So it's a critical time for them to come out and get their calories back, which means that even if we have a late spring, we're not just affecting this year's cubs, we're also affecting last year's cubs' survival. So I'll say it again, that 2022 was a really, really good spring, and we're looking at some really nice cub conditions out there going into the fall. So there's next image here is a mom hunting for her cub, and that cub is going to have to learn pretty quickly how to hunt for himself as well, but she will support that cub over the next 2.5 years of his life. So with that, we've come all the way back around to spring, and I want to make sure we have some time for questions. So I will hand things back over to Rob.
All right. Now, before we begin our question and answer session, I would like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. So let's get started with this. Have there been many Churchill trips that you have guided where you have not seen polar bears?
I mean, I'm in Churchill a lot of the year, so there have been many times where I've been in Churchill and not seen bears. Most of those times I would expect to not see bears, like through our Northern Lights trips in February and March. Um, we always consider safety-wise that no time is completely bear-free in Churchill, but we have seen on occasion in the past, I think it's been twice in our couple of decades of running trips, where there's been a very cold snap that's formed an ice shelf. And there has definitely been a couple of trips at the end of a year where there were no bears sighted on land. They were able to sight bears in helicopters on those trips, but the bears had all pretty well moved on to that shelf. That was an interesting year because that shelf that ice that had formed actually blew off, taking the bears with it. And then about a week later, the wind flipped around, pushed the ice back, and all the bears came back onto land and stayed there another month or so. So you never really know with nature exactly what's going to happen. NatHab is very, very consistently good at picking the right times to show you bears, always keeping in mind that nature is nature and wildlife is wild.
Good point. So do polar bears have a pig or a black pigmented tongues? Why are they so different?
Yeah, you might have seen images of this before, right? So you see the nose and around the eyes, you can tell that the skin is quite dark. And even on the snout of this bear you can see here, you probably get a sense that it's almost a bluish color behind it. That is the dark skin. So when polar bears are born, they are pink skinned, but they will darken up fairly quickly to have a black or a bluish skin. And you see some people calling the tongue black. I'll call it gray. It's not pure black for sure. There's various theories around why that is the case. One of the theories being that it aids in heat retention, but it hasn't really been shown experimentally that the skin color has a lot to do with how warm the bear stays. The heat that they get is primarily through insulation, and through metabolizing fat releases a lot of heat as well. So as far as we know, there's no one reason why polar bears have black fur. And so I'd say for now, so not black fur, black skin. So it may be one of those mysteries until somebody comes up with a better answer for that one.
So how deep out on the ice will a polar bear go?
Polar bears range so very, very far on the ice. And some of the really interesting things around polar bears are, science in general, I always think is what we don't know and how much we can learn as science progresses. So when I was showing those images of tracked bears and where they are located, you may have noticed that by April, they were scattered all around Hudson Bay. So they'll range at least 300 or 400 kilometers. However, there's a big discrepancy in how far females will range and how far males will range on average. And over the past number of years, just to discrepancies in the size of the head and the neck between the male and the female, we've only been able to collar polar bear females. So basically all of the movement data and the range data and the habitat use data that we had for decades only came from polar bear females. And it's only in the last couple of years, as new technologies have been developed, that we've been able to tag polar bear males to see how far they range. And as many people thought, based on some like single point counts where bear X was found over here, and then 5 years later, bear X was found way over there, we have seen that polar bear males do tend to range further than females will. And in fact, there's at least one male that's crossed the North Pole a couple of times, going between North America over to Russia and back again. We don't see that behavior in females. It seems to be a very, very male-specific behavior. So we're still learning about this, but the short answer is probably further than you think, further than we knew 5 years ago, and easily on the range of 1,000 miles.
Wow, that's amazing. So, do polar bears regularly eat fish, and would they take advantage of, say, the salmon run in the Hudson Bay?
Yes, polar bears will definitely fish. They are not as specialized. Like if you've ever seen those images of grizzly bears or brown bears fishing, or you've been to some place like Brooks Falls and you've seen those bears just popping the fish out one after another, polar bears tend not to do that, but they are incredibly smart and opportunistic, and where those opportunities exist, they will take them. So there's some great footage of polar bears fishing coming off of areas like Greenland and like Svalbard, especially in those rivers that have distinct fish runs. But even in the Churchill area, where it's much more difficult for bears to catch fish, you will still see them behaving very opportunistically around fish. So something that can happen that we see in Churchill is that as the ponds freeze, the fish that are in the ponds will sometimes be trapped in that layer of ice close to the surface. And bears even then will dig down and eat the ice-trapped fish, even in Churchill. So in terms of, are there enough calories in those fish? Well, some bears in various places, yeah, probably do get enough calories just from fish that they wouldn't need to hunt a lot of seals. But for your majority of bears, they are still quite reliant on seals and other marine mammals to make up the bulk of their calories. Fish just, they're not fatty enough for polar bears is the short answer there.
So, how long do cubs nurse, and when do they start eating meat?
Oh, cubs will nurse the whole time that they are with their mom. They will nurse less and less as time goes on. But if they were weaned at 1.5 years, as most polar bear cubs were 20 years ago in Western Hudson Bay, they would have been done at that point. If they're staying with their mom for 2.5 years, they nurse for 2.5 years. If they're with her 3.5 years, they nurse for 3.5 years. And if you remember that shot of the mom with the twins walking away from a polar bear male, those cubs can sometimes be bigger than their mom and still be nursing. So if you have a small female who's the mom combined with a large male cub, you will sometimes see a bigger than his mom cub nursing still before he is weaned. It's something to see for sure.
So, are there polar bears in Antarctica?
Ah, there are no polar bears in Antarctica. I know that sometimes it comes up as a question as to whether or not, as a thought exercise, if we plunk some polar bears down in Antarctica, how would they do? Well, in some ways, probably pretty well. The prey species that they would have there, like the penguins and some of the seals, aren't used to terrestrial predators. So they're quite used to being able to sit out on the sea ice without something hunting and eating them. When you see the ring seal in the Arctic, they have to hide their pups. And even then, nearly half the ring seal pups every year get eaten by polar bears. And that's with really, really well hidden pups. Every so often, a polar bear will get lucky and make its way down off the coast of Newfoundland to where harp seals will pup. And harp seals pup directly onto the sea ice. They don't do it in dens. They don't cover up in any way. You may have seen images of harp seals before. The pups are those beautiful white-coated pups that make great images. And when a polar bear comes through a harp seal pupping colony, it is a massacre. So they will just eat every single pup, every single one, because they are just lying out there for the picking. And I think if you ever had a polar bear who was lucky enough to make its way to Antarctica, it would be something similarly decimating for the local populations of seals and seabirds, because they just would not have any defenses against the polar bears.
Do the polar bears have any natural enemies, or are they top of the food chain?
Polar bears are pretty well top of the food chain, and you really get a sense for that sometimes when you're beside one, where you can tell with those big polar bears who have been around the block a few times, maybe 10 or 15 years old. They know that they're at the top of the food chain, and they don't really care what you're going to do unless you jump down in front of them, and then they might just eat you. So they are very much at the top, with the exception of they are still harvested by some communities for food as part of a sustainable indigenous hunt. And polar bears are often, or not often, polar bears are sometimes eaten by other polar bears. When polar bear cubs and their moms are making their way from the polar bear maternity dens in Western Hudson Bay onto the ice, they have two main predators. One is the wolves that will hunt the cubs on their way to the ice, and one is polar bear males. When I just realized I hadn't answered the question about how quickly they eat meat, they will start to eat meat once they're on the ice with their mom, so around 3 to 4 months old. So they are definitely carnivores, and they are carnivores for their whole life, and they do not stop at eating their own species.
Well, unfortunately, Eleanor, that's going to be the last question that we do have time for today. So I'd like to hand it back to you for your closing comments.
Well, thanks everybody so much for coming by today. I hope you enjoyed learning about the polar bears. I hope that you're feeling good about how the polar bears are doing this year, because they are such fat and happy bears this summer. I'm so excited to go into this fall season to see what those bears are looking like this fall. If you're interested in any of our polar bear trips, you can find more information on our website. We do often a number of bear-focused trips in the Churchill region, and I would love to see some of you up there someday. It's a really special time to see these bears, and they're very, very amazing animals.
Thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I would also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. If you're interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, please give us a call at the number on your screen, or send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us next week for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out next week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.